Story number 1. The Room That Remembers. Sarah Mitchell had been a night shift nurse at St. Augustine Medical Center for 7 years, long enough to have seen nearly everything the emergency department could throw at her. She'd handled trauma cases that would make most people faint, dealt with psychiatric emergencies that tested every ounce of her training, and worked through countless nights where exhaustion blurred the line between awake and asleep. But nothing in those 7 years had prepared her for what happened during her rotation in the hospital's oldest wing. St. Augustine was a sprawling facility that had grown organically over its 120-year history, with new buildings grafted onto old structures in a way that created a labyrinthine maze of corridors and forgotten spaces. The original building, constructed in 1903, still formed the hospital's core, though most of it had been modernized beyond recognition. Most, but not all. The 4th floor of the East Wing remained largely unchanged, used primarily for long-term care patients and those requiring extended observation periods. Sarah received her assignment on a Tuesday evening in late October. The charge nurse, a stern woman named Margaret who'd worked at St. Augustine for nearly 30 years, handed her the floor chart with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "You'll be covering 4 East tonight," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. "We're short-staffed, so you'll be handling the whole wing alone until midnight when Kelly comes in for backup." The 4th floor was quiet when Sarah arrived, her sneakers squeaking softly against the old linoleum that the hospital had never bothered to replace. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by fluorescent lights that hummed with a frequency that seemed to vibrate in her teeth. She had 8 patients total, most of them elderly and requiring minimal intervention during the night hours. Room 408, however, was empty, though the chart indicated it had been occupied until 3 days prior. Sarah's first few hours passed uneventfully. She completed her initial rounds, checking vitals and dispensing medications, making small talk with those patients who were awake and alert enough to appreciate the company. Mr. Henderson in 403 told her about his grandchildren. Mrs. Chen in 406 complained about the food, as she did every night according to the notes. Everything was routine, comfortable, exactly as a quiet night shift should be. It was just after 10 o'clock when Sarah first heard the sound coming from room 408. She was at the nurse's station, updating patient charts on the computer, when a soft but distinct beeping reached her ears. It sounded like a heart monitor, the steady electronic pulse that formed the constant background noise of any hospital floor. But room 408 was empty. She checked it herself during her initial rounds, finding nothing but a stripped bed and the faint smell of industrial cleaner. Sarah walked down the hallway, her instincts telling her to investigate even as her rational mind offered explanations. Maybe maintenance had left equipment in there. Perhaps the room above or below was occupied and she was hearing sounds through the ventilation system. The beeping grew louder as she approached, unmistakably coming from behind the closed door of 408. She pushed the door open and froze. The room was no longer empty. A hospital bed now occupied the space where she'd seen only bare floor hours before. And in that bed lay a patient, an elderly man, his face deeply lined and his breathing labored, connected to a heart monitor that displayed a steady rhythm. An IV drip fed into his left arm. The overhead light cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Had another nurse admitted a patient without updating the board? Had she somehow missed this during her rounds, though she distinctly remembered the empty room? She stepped closer, reaching for the patient's wrist to check his pulse manually, when she noticed the chart hanging at the foot of the bed. The name read Walter Brennan, and the admission date was October 23, 1987, 36 years ago. Sarah's hand trembled as she picked up the chart, flipping through pages that felt brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the medical terminology outdated, the diagnosis, terminal lung cancer. metastasized to the liver and brain. Expected prognosis, days, possibly hours. The notes documented a steady decline, increasing pain medication, family visitors becoming less frequent as hope faded. The last entry, dated October 29, 1987, simply read, "Patient expired at 2:47 a.m. Body released to family." Sarah looked up at the monitor. It showed 10:47 p.m. and the heart continued its steady beating. The man in the bed, Walter Brennan, if the chart was to be believed, lay perfectly still except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His eyes were closed, his hands resting at his sides. He looked exactly like thousands of dying patients Sarah had seen before, suspended in that peculiar space between life and death that hospitals knew so well. She backed toward the door, her nursing training warring with the rising panic in her chest. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. Yet the monitor beeped with absolute consistency. The IV dripped at a measured pace, and the man in the bed continued his labored breathing. Sarah returned to the nurse's station and pulled up the hospital's patient database, searching for any record of Walter Brennan. The system went back 20 years, but she found nothing. She tried the archived records, the ones stored in the basement that documented the hospital's older history. But accessing those required permission she didn't have at this hour. She called Margaret, trying to keep her voice steady as she explained the situation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Room 408, Margaret finally said, and Sarah could hear something in her voice that might have been resignation or perhaps recognition. "I should have warned you. I'm sorry. I always forget about that room until someone reports it." "Reports what?" Sarah demanded. "What's happening?" "The room remembers," Margaret said quietly. "Every few months someone sees it. Usually night shift, usually when they're alone. It shows you a patient who died there, plays out their final hours like a recording. Walter Brennan died in that room in 1987. Before him it was others. The room has had a lot of deaths over the years." Sarah wanted to argue, to demand a rational explanation, but she could hear the beeping from down the hall. "What am I supposed to do?" "Nothing," Margaret said. "You can't interact with it. If you try to touch the patient or the equipment, your hand passes through. The vision, or whatever it is, will play out until the moment of death, and then everything disappears. It's disturbing, I know, but it's not dangerous. Just stay away from the room until it's over." But Sarah found she couldn't stay away. Despite Margaret's warning, despite every rational instinct screaming at her to avoid room 408, she found herself drawn back to the doorway throughout the night. Each time she looked, the scene had progressed. The clock on the wall advanced, though faster than real time. The man's breathing became more labored. The heart monitor's rhythm grew irregular. At 11:30, she watched as translucent figures appeared in the room, a woman and two younger people, clearly family members. They stood around the bed, their mouths moving in conversation Sarah couldn't hear. The woman held the dying man's hand, tears streaming down her face. The scene had a grainy quality, like watching an old film, but the emotions were devastatingly clear. At midnight, Kelly arrived for her shift, and Sarah tried to explain what was happening. Kelly listened with the patient expression of someone who'd heard this before. "Yeah, 408 does that sometimes," she confirmed. "I saw it once about 2 years ago, different patient though. An old woman who died of heart failure back in the 90s. Creeped me right out." They watched together as the scene reached its conclusion. The family members faded away, leaving only the dying man and the relentless beeping of machines. His breathing stopped first, that final exhale that Sarah had witnessed so many times in her career. The heart monitor showed increasing irregularity, the peaks and valleys becoming erratic before finally flattening to a single, sustained tone. Then, as Margaret had promised, everything vanished. The bed, the equipment, the patient. All of it dissolved like morning mist, leaving only the empty room Sarah had seen at the start of her shift. The silence was profound, broken only by the humming of the hallway lights. Sarah completed her shift in a daze, going through the motions of her remaining rounds while her mind struggled to process what she'd witnessed. When she finally left the hospital at 7 in the morning, the early sunlight felt like a blessing, washing away some of the night's strangeness. But it wasn't over. Over the following week, Sarah found herself assigned to the 4th floor East Wing repeatedly, far more often than random chance should have allowed, and each time room 408 showed her something. Different patients, different deaths, different decades. A young man dying of AIDS in 1994. A middle-aged woman succumbing to complications from surgery in 1978. A child, that one Sarah could barely stand to witness, who'd never recovered from a car accident in 2003. She started researching the hospital's history, spending her off days in the medical library reviewing old records and death certificates. Room 408 had an unusually high mortality rate, she'd discovered, though nothing that would raise official red flags. People died in hospitals, but this particular room had seen more than its statistical share, and the deaths stretched back decades to when the building first opened. The most disturbing pattern Sarah uncovered was the timing. Every patient the room showed her had died between the hours of 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. Every single one. And all of them had died alone, their families either gone home for the night or not present at all. The room, it seemed, remembered loneliness. It replayed the deaths of those who'd faced their final moments without comfort, broadcasting their solitary endings to whoever was unlucky enough to be working that floor. Sarah requested a transfer to a different wing, but her request was denied due to staffing shortages. She considered quitting, finding work at a different hospital, but something kept her there. Perhaps it was a sense of duty to the patients she could help, the living ones who needed her care. Or perhaps, she admitted to herself in darker moments, she felt a strange obligation to witness these recorded deaths, to ensure that these people, decades after their passing, weren't dying alone anymore. The night that changed everything came 3 months into her haunting. Sarah was working her usual shift when room 408's door opened during her rounds, though she hadn't touched it. Inside, she found a familiar scene. A hospital bed, a dying patient, the steady beep of monitors. But this time, when she looked at the chart, she felt her blood turn to ice. The name on the chart was Sarah Mitchell. The admission date was today's date, and the expected time of death was listed as 2:47 a.m., less than 4 hours away. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. The room showed the past, not the future. It remembered deaths that had already occurred, not ones that were yet to come. But as she stared at the figure in the bed, she recognized her own face, aged and drawn, but unmistakably hers. The chart listed injuries consistent with a severe car accident, internal bleeding, multiple fractures, traumatic brain injury. The kind of injuries that could happen to anyone, anytime on the drive home from a night shift when exhaustion made you just a fraction of a second too slow to avoid a collision. Sarah ran from the room, from the floor, from the hospital itself. She called in sick for her next 3 shifts, then took a week of personal leave. She avoided driving, avoided the hospital, avoided thinking about what the room had shown her. But she couldn't avoid it forever. When she finally returned to work, she was assigned to a different floor. Room 408 was closed for maintenance, according to the official schedule. But Sarah saw the way the older nurses looked at her, a mixture of pity and understanding in their eyes. They knew. They'd seen something too at some point in their careers. The room didn't just remember the past. Sometimes, rarely, it remembered the future too. Sarah Mitchell still works at St. Augustine Medical Center. but she's transferred to the day shift and refuses assignments in the East Wing. She drives carefully, obsessively checking her mirrors and maintaining defensive driving practices that border on paranoid. The date that was listed on that phantom chart has come and gone without incident, but she can't forget what she saw. The room is still there, still used for patients when bed space is tight, and sometimes on night shifts when the hospital is quiet and the fluorescent lights hum their endless song. Nurses report seeing things in room 408 that shouldn't be there. The hospital has learned to simply accept it, this strange phenomenon that defies explanation. They don't talk about it openly, don't document it in any official capacity, but they remember. Just like the room remembers. Story number 2, the third shift protocol. Dr. James Chen had been an emergency physician for 12 years when he accepted the position at Riverside General Hospital, a mid-sized facility serving a county population of roughly 200,000. The job offered better pay than his previous position, more reasonable hours, and the promise of state-of-the-art equipment in a recently renovated emergency department. What the recruitment materials and his interview hadn't mentioned was the third shift protocol, a set of procedures that existed nowhere in the official hospital documentation, but that every staff member who worked overnight knew and followed without question. James discovered the protocol during his third week on the job during his first scheduled overnight shift. He'd drawn the Sunday night slot, generally one of the quieter nights in emergency medicine, a chance to handle the minor complaints and routine cases that couldn't wait until morning but weren't quite urgent. Enough for Saturday night chaos. The shift started normally enough. A teenager with a suspected broken wrist from skateboarding, an elderly man with chest pain that turned out to be severe heartburn, a young woman with a kidney stone. At exactly midnight, the emergency department's senior nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at Riverside for 23 years, approached James with a clipboard that held no paperwork. Just a single typed page sealed in plastic. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice professionally neutral. "I need to brief you on the third shift protocol." James looked up from the chart he was reviewing, confused. "What protocol? I don't remember seeing that in the orientation materials." Patricia glanced around the emergency department, checking that no patients were within earshot, then handed him the plastic-sealed page. "It's not in the official documentation. It can't be. But you need to know it, and you need to follow it exactly. No deviations, no exceptions, no matter what you see or hear." The page contained a numbered list of rules, typed in an old-fashioned font that suggested the document had been created decades ago and simply reprinted over the years. James read through them with growing disbelief. Between midnight and 5 a.m., if a patient presents with no identification, no memory of how they arrived, and injuries consistent with severe trauma but no pain response, do not admit them. If the patient described in Rule 1 insists on treatment, provide only basic wound cleaning and bandaging. Do not order imaging, blood work, or any diagnostic tests. If you hear children's laughter coming from the pediatric ward between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., do not investigate. The pediatric ward has been closed since 1989. Should a patient in examination room 7 claim to see another person in the room with them when no one is visible to staff, believe them. Make notes in the chart, but do not discuss it with the patient. If the elevator to the basement morgue arrives at the emergency department level without being called, do not enter it. Wait for it to return to the basement on its own. Any patient who gives their address as 1157 Maple Street should be treated with standard care, but their medical records must be filed separately and not entered into the digital system. Between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. you may hear someone paging Dr. Hollow over the intercom. Do not respond. There is no Dr. Hollow on staff. If a patient's monitor shows a heartbeat but the patient has no pulse, continue treatment as if the pulse is present. Do not declare death until after 5 a.m. The list continued for 17 items, each more bizarre than the last. James looked up at Patricia, ready to laugh at what he assumed was an elaborate prank played on new doctors. But her expression stopped him. She was completely serious. "Is this a joke?" he asked anyway, hoping for confirmation. "I wish it were," Patricia replied quietly. "I know how it sounds. But every rule on that list exists because someone learned the hard way what happens when you don't follow it. The hospital administration doesn't acknowledge the protocol officially because they can't. How would they explain it? But they know about it and they know we follow it." James wanted to argue, to demand rational explanations, but something in Patricia's eyes, a deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, made him hesitate. "What happens if I don't follow the protocol?" "Different things depending on which rule you break," Patricia said. "Usually something goes wrong that can't quite be explained. Equipment fails in impossible ways, patients deteriorate for no medical reason, staff members have accidents, and sometimes—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes people see things that change them, things they can't unsee or forget." The night progressed, and James found himself thinking about the protocol despite his skepticism. He was a man of science, trained in evidence-based medicine, someone who believed in rational explanations and empirical data. The idea that a hospital would need a set of supernatural rules was absurd. Yet he couldn't quite dismiss Patricia's obvious sincerity or the fact that she'd worked here for more than 2 decades. At 2:17 a.m., James heard it, the high, clear sound of children laughing echoing through the hallway that led to the older part of the hospital. The emergency department was quiet at that moment, with no pediatric patients present. The laughter continued for perhaps 30 seconds, the sound of multiple children playing, joyful and innocent. James stood ready to investigate when Patricia's hand landed firmly on his arm. "Rule 3, she said simply. "Don't." "But there could be kids wandering around up there," James protested. "It's a safety issue." "The pediatric ward has been closed for 36 years, Patricia reminded him. "The doors are locked and there's no way for anyone to get in there. Security checks it every night. Whatever you'd find if you went to investigate it wouldn't be children. Not living ones." James sat back down, his mouth dry. The laughter faded away, and he forced himself to focus on patient charts, on concrete medical facts, on anything that would ground him in reality. At 3:03 a.m., the intercom crackled to life. "Dr. Hollow to the emergency department. Dr. Hollow, please report to the ED." James looked at Patricia, who simply shook her head. The page repeated twice more over the next 10 minutes, the operator's voice flat and mechanical. No one responded. James checked the hospital directory later and confirmed that there was no Dr. Hollow on staff, nor had there ever been according to the records he could access. The real test came at 3:47 a.m. An ambulance arrived with a patient, a woman appearing to be in her 40s, brought in by paramedics who reported finding her wandering on Highway 51 approximately 3 miles from the hospital. The patient had no identification, no memory of who she was or how she'd gotten there, and presented with injuries that made James's stomach clench. Deep lacerations across her abdomen and chest, a compound fracture of her left arm with bone visibly protruding, and contusions consistent with severe blunt force trauma. But the woman showed no signs of pain. She sat calmly on the gurney, looking around with mild curiosity, seemingly unaware that she should be screaming in agony from injuries that would have most people unconscious from shock. Rule 1. James felt his hands begin to shake as he examined the patient, his mind racing through medical possibilities that might explain this presentation. Severe nerve damage? Impossible, not with this distribution of injuries. Psychological shock? Perhaps, but her affect wasn't consistent with trauma-induced dissociation. She seemed genuinely unconcerned, even slightly puzzled by all the attention. "I'm fine, really," the woman said, her voice pleasant. "I just need to get home. Can someone give me a ride?" Patricia appeared at James's elbow, her presence a quiet reminder. He looked down at the woman's injuries again, at the bone jutting from her arm, at the deep wounds that should have been bleeding far more than they were. He thought about Rule 2. Basic wound care only. No diagnostic tests. "Ma'am," James said, his voice professionally steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I'd like to clean and bandage your injuries. Would that be all right?" The woman considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose that would be fine." For the next 40 minutes, James provided exactly the treatment specified in the protocol. Careful cleaning of the wounds with saline, application of antibiotic ointment, and simple bandaging. He didn't order x-rays for the broken arm, didn't take blood to check for internal bleeding, didn't do any of the standard procedures that his training screamed at him were necessary. Patricia assisted him, her movements efficient and practiced. Someone who'd done this before. The woman tolerated the treatment without any reaction, neither flinching from pain nor asking questions about her condition. When James finished, she thanked him politely, stood up from the gurney with the compound fracture and severe lacerations, seemingly no impediment to movement, and walked toward the exit. "Wait," James called after her. "You can't just leave. You need proper medical care, surgery." She turned back, and for just a moment James saw something in her eyes that wasn't quite right. A quality that he couldn't name but that raised every primitive alarm his brain possessed. "I'm going home now," she said, still in that pleasant, mild tone. "Thank you for the bandages." She walked out into the parking lot, and despite James rushing to the door to follow her, she'd vanished completely by the time he got outside. No woman, no vehicle driving away, no trace that she'd existed at all except for the bloodied bandage wrappers in the examination room. James returned to the emergency department in a daze. Patricia met his eyes and nodded slowly, a gesture that conveyed both sympathy and understanding. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "Following the protocol." "What was she?" James asked, not really expecting an answer. "Does it matter?" Patricia replied. "She's gone, you're safe, and the night will be over in a few hours. That's what matters." But James couldn't let it go. Over the following weeks, he began researching, digging into the hospital's history during his off hours. Riverside General had been built in 1952 on land that had previously been home to a county sanitarium, one of those grim institutions where the mentally ill and terminally sick were warehoused in conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. The sanitarium had burned in 1948, killing 43 patients and 7 staff members. The pediatric ward that had been closed since 1989 had shut down after a tragedy that the hospital had kept quiet. A fire in the middle of the night that killed 5 children due to faulty smoke detectors and locked fire exits. Room 7, mentioned in Rule 4, had been the site of multiple patient suicides over the hospital's history, enough that it had nearly been permanently closed before being renovated. 1157 Maple Street, the address from Rule 6, was the location of a house that had burned down in 1974, killing an entire family of 6. Maple Street had been renamed and renumbered years ago, and 1157 technically no longer existed, yet patients occasionally listed it as their address, always with the same vacant look in their eyes. Dr. Hollow had been a surgeon at Riverside in the 1960s who'd operated while intoxicated and killed 3 patients on the table before being discovered. He'd hanged himself in his office, and his name had been systematically removed from all official records as part of a legal settlement with the victims' families. The elevator to the morgue had malfunctioned in 1981, trapping an orderly inside for 16 hours before he was discovered, dead from a heart attack. Since then, it occasionally operated on its own, arriving at various floors with no one inside. as if still carrying out the routes that Orderly had traveled. Each rule in the protocol had a story, a tragedy, a moment when the hospital's normal boundaries had been breached by something that couldn't be explained by medical science. The protocol wasn't arbitrary. It was an accumulation of hard-won knowledge, written in the trauma and terror of staff members who'd encountered things that challenged their understanding of reality. James continued to work at Riverside General, continued to follow the protocol during his overnight shifts, though each incident chipped away at the certainty he'd once had about the rational, ordered nature of the world. He saw the woman with no pain response twice more over the following year, each time presenting with different but equally horrific injuries, each time walking away after receiving only basic wound care. He heard Dr. Hollow paged on countless nights and learned to ignore it, though the first few times he had to physically restrain himself from responding. Years of conditioning making him want to answer a call for help. He learned which examination rooms had presences that patients could sense, which hallways seemed longer during certain hours, which equipment would malfunction in patterns that defied statistical probability. The other staff members who worked third shift became his strange fraternity. Bound together by shared experiences they couldn't discuss with day shift workers or anyone outside the hospital. They traded stories in quiet moments, comparing notes on protocol encounters, offering support when someone had a particularly disturbing experience. Dr. James Chen still works at Riverside General Hospital, now training new emergency physicians in the official procedures while quietly ensuring they learn about the third shift protocol from senior nurses like Patricia. He's learned to exist in a state of cognitive dissonance, practicing evidence-based medicine by day while acknowledging that some phenomena can't be explained by any medical text. The protocol continues to be followed night after night, its rules protecting staff and patients from consequences that no one wants to trigger again. New rules get added occasionally when someone encounters something novel that requires a procedural response. The document grows longer year by year, a living record of a hospital's hidden history. And between midnight and 5 a.m., when the barriers between what should be and what is grow thin, the third shift staff maintain their vigil, following rules that exist nowhere officially but that everyone knows by heart. Because in a place where people come to die and where the line between life and death is crossed daily, sometimes the dead don't leave completely. Sometimes they linger, following patterns and protocols of their own, and the living must learn to navigate around them. James has stopped questioning why it happens. He's learned that some questions don't have answers, or at least not answers that human minds can comfortably process. Instead, he follows the protocol, protects his staff, treats his patients, and counts down the hours until sunrise, when the hospital returns to being just a building where medicine is practiced, and the impossible recedes for another day. But he knows that when midnight comes again, the protocol will be necessary. It always is. Story number 3, the patient in room 309, Rebecca. Torres had worked as a medical records clerk at Memorial Hospital for 4 years, a job that suited her preference for organization and solitude. While nurses and doctors dealt with the chaos of patient care, Rebecca maintained order in the administrative wing, ensuring that every test result, every physician's note, every piece of documentation found its proper place in the vast filing system that kept the hospital running. It was quiet work, predictable work, and Rebecca liked it that way. Memorial Hospital used a hybrid system for medical records with recent files digitized and older records still maintained in physical form in the basement archives. Rebecca's job involved both worlds, scanning historical documents into the computer system while managing the current paper flow that still existed despite administration's best efforts at going fully digital. She knew the filing system better than anyone else on staff, could locate a patient file from 20 years ago in under 10 minutes, and took pride in the accuracy of her work. The problem with Room 309 started when Rebecca was asked to pull historical records for a legal case involving alleged malpractice from 15 years earlier. The lawyer handling the case needed complete documentation for a patient named Marcus Weinberg, who'd been admitted to Memorial in 2008 for complications related to diabetes. It should have been a straightforward request, but when Rebecca went to retrieve the file, she discovered an anomaly. According to the digital database, Marcus Weinberg had been admitted to Room 309 on March 14, 2008 and discharged on March 19, 2008, after successful treatment of a diabetic ulcer. But when Rebecca pulled the physical file, she found something different. The handwritten notes, which should have matched the digital records, told a different story. The patient in Room 309 during those dates, according to the physical chart, was not Marcus Weinberg, but someone named Thomas Brennan, admitted for pneumonia. Rebecca assumed it was a simple filing error, someone misfiling a chart in the wrong folder. It happened occasionally, despite everyone's best efforts. But when she searched for Thomas Brennan in the digital system, she found no record of anyone by that name ever being admitted to Memorial Hospital. The search came back empty, as if he'd never existed. Puzzled, Rebecca decided to investigate further. She went to the archives and pulled all the room logs for 2008, the massive binders that tracked which patients occupied which rooms on any given date. These logs were maintained separately from individual patient files, serving as a master index that had been used before the digital system took over. Room 309 in March 2008 showed 3 different names depending on which documentation she consulted. The digital database said Marcus Weinberg. The physical patient chart said Thomas Brennan. The room log said Michelle Carver. 3 completely different patients, 3 completely different medical conditions, 3 separate stories that somehow all claimed the same room during the same dates. Rebecca's next step was to check with the billing department. If nothing else, billing records were meticulously maintained for obvious financial reasons. But the billing database added yet another layer of confusion. It showed that Room 309 had been vacant during the entire month of March 2008, undergoing maintenance for a plumbing issue. 4 different sources, 4 different stories, all claiming to be the definitive truth about Room 309 during 5 days in March 2008. Rebecca felt the first stirrings of unease, that sensation that something was wrong in a way that went beyond simple record-keeping errors. She decided to examine Room 309's history more comprehensively. Using her access to the archives, Rebecca pulled every document she could find relating to that room, going back decades. What she discovered made her skin prickle with something that might have been fear or might have been the kind of intense curiosity that overrides common sense. Room 309 had inconsistencies throughout its entire history. Patient names never quite matched across different record systems. Admission and discharge dates conflicted. Diagnoses changed depending on which document you consulted. It was as if the room existed in multiple versions of reality simultaneously, with each record-keeping system capturing a different iteration. But the inconsistencies weren't random. Rebecca noticed patterns. Every 7 to 9 months, a cluster of conflicting records would appear, always involving Room 309, always showing 3 to 5 different patients occupying the room during the same time period. Between these clusters, the room's records would be normal, consistent across all systems, unremarkable. Rebecca created a timeline plotting out the clusters going back to 1982 when Memorial's oldest surviving digital records began. The pattern was clear. Regular intervals of documentary chaos, like a clock ticking away at something that defied normal explanation. The most recent cluster, she realized with a chill, had occurred 8 months ago. If the pattern held, the next one was due within the next few weeks. Against her better judgment, Rebecca decided to investigate room 309 directly. The hospital's patient rooms were generally off-limits to administrative staff unless they had specific business there. But Rebecca used the excuse of needing to verify room numbers for record-keeping purposes. She took the elevator to the third floor and found room 309 in the middle of the hallway, unremarkable among the other patient rooms on the medical surgical floor. The room was currently occupied. Through the small window in the door, Rebecca could see a patient in the bed, an elderly woman attached to various monitors sleeping peacefully. The whiteboard outside the room listed the patient's name as Dorothy Simmons, admitted 3 days ago for congestive heart failure. Everything looked completely normal. Rebecca checked the digital database on her phone. Dorothy Simmons, room 309, exactly as the whiteboard indicated. She felt slightly foolish for expecting anything different. This was a hospital room, not some portal to another dimension. The record inconsistencies were probably just decades of accumulated clerical errors, nothing more. She was about to leave when she noticed something odd about the door itself. The room number, 309, was displayed in modern plastic digits, but beneath them, barely visible unless you looked closely, were the faint outlines of older numbers that had been painted over. 313, and beneath that, even fainter, another set, 307. Rebecca ran her fingers over the door, feeling the slight ridges where multiple layers of paint and number changes had built up over the years. The room had been renumbered at least 3 times, though she could find no documentation of this in any official records. She pulled out her phone and checked the hospital's floor plans, both current and archived. According to every floor plan in the system, this room had always been 309. Over the next few days, Rebecca became obsessed with solving the mystery. She spent her lunch breaks in the archives, her evenings at home cross-referencing documents, her weekends trying to find patterns in the chaos. She discovered that room 309's first documented inconsistency occurred in 1976, shortly after a major renovation of the third floor. Before that, records were consistent, though the room had been numbered differently. She also discovered something else. Patients who stayed in room 309 during the cluster periods, when the records showed multiple conflicting occupants, often had unusual outcomes. Not necessarily bad outcomes, but statistically improbable ones. Terminal patients who unexpectedly recovered. Minor conditions that became life-threatening. People who died of complications that should have been easily manageable. The room seemed to be a place where normal medical probabilities didn't quite apply. Rebecca's breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when she was filing daily patient reports and noticed that room 309 currently showed 2 patients in the digital system. Dorothy Simmons, the elderly woman she'd seen through the window, and someone named Peter Albridge, admitted for complications from chemotherapy. Both records showed the same room, the same bed, admitted at the same time, currently in residence. She immediately went to the third floor to investigate. The whiteboard outside room 309 still showed only Dorothy Simmons. The woman was still in the bed, still peacefully sleeping. But when Rebecca checked the monitors and equipment, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. The heart monitor showed 2 distinct heartbeats, overlapping but not synchronized, creating a strange doubled rhythm that should have been impossible. The IV pump displayed 2 different medication regimens running simultaneously. The chart hanging at the foot of the bed, when she dared to flip through it, seemed to shift between 2 different sets of handwriting, 2 different patient histories, 2 different people occupying the same physical space. Rebecca backed out of the room and found a nurse, a young man named David, who was checking medications at the nurse's station. "Room 309, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "How many patients are currently in that room?" David looked at his computer screen. "Just Mrs. Simmons. Why?" Can you check the digital system, the main database? He pulled it up, frowning. Weird. It's showing two patients, Dorothy Simmons and Peter Albridge, but that can't be right. I've been checking on Mrs. Simmons all day and she's alone in there. Have you ever heard of Peter Albridge? Rebecca asked. David's frown deepened. Actually, yeah. He was a patient about, God, must be 4 or 5 years ago. I remember because he had the same last name as my high school principal. But he died. Complications from chemo, like the record says. He was in... David paused, his face going pale. He was in room 309. The cluster was beginning right on schedule according to the pattern Rebecca had discovered. Over the next 3 days, the digital database showed 4 different patients occupying room 309 simultaneously. Dorothy Simmons, Peter Albridge, a woman named Susan Chen, and a teenager named Robert McKay. Physical examination of the room showed only Dorothy Simmons, but the equipment attached to her displayed vital signs for multiple patients, the monitors flickering between different readouts, the IV pumps cycling through different medications, the chart at the foot of the bed becoming a palimpsest of overlapping medical histories. Rebecca documented everything, taking photos and notes, building a case file that grew more disturbing with each passing hour. She discovered that Susan Chen had died in room 309 in 2011 from a pulmonary embolism. Robert McKay had been treated there in 2017 for injuries from a car accident and had recovered fully, one of the room's statistical anomalies. The patients weren't random. They were all former occupants of room 309, their medical histories somehow replaying simultaneously, their stays overlapping in impossible ways. The room was experiencing temporal collapse, pulling together different moments from its history and displaying them at the same time. Dorothy Simmons, the current physical occupant, seemed unaware of the strangeness. She complained of odd sensations, of feeling crowded in her room despite being alone, of hearing voices and seeing shadows, but the medical staff attributed these to her medications or the general confusion that often accompanies hospital stays in elderly patients. Rebecca knew she should report what she'd discovered, but who would believe her? She had no rational explanation for what was happening, just documentation of an impossible phenomenon. Instead, she continued to monitor the situation, visiting room 309 daily, watching as the temporal collapse intensified. On the 5th day of Dorothy Simmons's stay, Rebecca entered the room and found it empty. Not just empty of patients, but empty of everything. No bed, no equipment, no furniture at all. The room was completely bare, just walls and floor and ceiling as if it had never been occupied. The monitors in the hallway showed flat lines for all 4 patients simultaneously. Rebecca ran to the nurse's station where David was staring at his computer screen in confusion. "Mrs. Simmons," he said without looking up. "She's gone. I mean, the room is empty. Her bed is gone, but the system still shows her as admitted. And it's showing all those other patients too, but now they're all coded as deceased. All of them, all at the same time." "What happened to Mrs. Simmons?" Rebecca demanded. "Where is she?" David shook his head helplessly. "I don't know. I checked on her an hour ago and everything was fine. Now the room is empty and I can't find any discharge orders, no record of her being moved, nothing." The hospital launched an investigation into Dorothy Simmons's disappearance, a process that consumed weeks and involved administrators, legal counsel, and eventually law enforcement. But they found nothing. No evidence of foul play, no trace of where the woman had gone, no explanation for how a patient, her bed, and all associated equipment could simply vanish from a room in the middle of a busy hospital floor. Rebecca kept her documentation of the temporal anomalies to herself, knowing it would sound insane if she tried to explain it. The investigation eventually concluded with a vague determination of administrative error, a bureaucratic way of admitting they had no idea what had happened. Room 309 was closed for 2 weeks for a thorough inspection that revealed nothing unusual. When it reopened, it functioned normally for several months, with patients admitted and discharged in the regular way. Records consistent across all systems, no anomalies detected. Rebecca continued her work in medical records, but she maintained her monitoring of Room 309, watching for the next cluster. 8 months after Dorothy Simmons disappeared, the inconsistencies began again. Different patients, different eras, all overlapping in the same impossible way. This time, Rebecca intervened. She went to hospital administration and, without explaining the full truth, recommended that Room 309 be permanently closed for structural issues. She presented documentation of the room's unusually high complication rate, its statistical anomalies in patient outcomes, enough data to make a case for closing the room without revealing the impossible nature of the problem. Administration agreed, more to avoid potential liability than because they believed the room itself was dangerous. Room 309 was officially decommissioned, its door locked, the room number removed. The space still exists, empty and unused, a gap in the third floor's patient roster that no one quite knows how to explain. Rebecca Torres still works at Memorial Hospital, still maintains the medical records with meticulous care. But she keeps her own private files now, documentation of a phenomenon she can't explain but can't ignore. She knows that closing the room didn't solve the problem, it only contained it. Whatever temporal anomaly exists in that space continues playing out its impossible overlapping histories to an audience of no one. Sometimes late at night when she's working in the archives, Rebecca thinks about Dorothy Simmons and wonders where the woman went. If she still exists somewhere in the fractured timeline that Room 309 created. She thinks about all the patients whose histories intersected in that space, their lives tangled together in ways that defy causality and reason. The medical records remain inconsistent for Room 309 even after its closure. The database still occasionally shows patients admitted to a room that no longer officially exists. Ghosts in the machine maintaining their vigil in a space that sits outside normal time. Rebecca files these phantom records away, maintaining documentation of the impossible. A keeper of secrets that the hospital can't acknowledge but can't erase. The room waits behind its locked door, still experiencing its temporal collapses on schedule, still pulling together different moments from its history into impossible simultaneity. And Rebecca watches, documents, and wonders if there are other rooms in other hospitals experiencing similar phenomena. Other spaces where time doesn't flow in the linear way it's supposed to, where the past and present and maybe even the future exist all at once. She's learned that some mysteries can't be solved, only managed. Some doors are better left locked, some records are better left unfiled. And some truths about the world we inhabit are too strange to speak aloud, so they exist only in private documentation, in whispered conversations, in the careful monitoring of spaces that behave in ways that shouldn't be possible. Room 309 remains closed, its secrets contained but not resolved, waiting in darkness for whatever comes next. Story number 4, The Transplant. Dr. Evelyn Marsh had performed hundreds of organ transplants during her 15-year career as a cardiothoracic surgeon at St. Catherine's Medical Center, one of the premier transplant centers on the East Coast. She'd held human hearts in her hands more times than she could count, had witnessed the moment when a dying patient received new life through the gift of donated organs, had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to disease and failure. She considered herself rational, scientific, firmly grounded in the empirical reality of medicine. That certainty ended with Michael Reeves. Michael was a 42-year-old high school teacher who'd been on the transplant waiting list for 8 months, his congenital heart defect progressing to the point where medication could no longer sustain him. His ejection fraction had dropped to 15%. His kidneys were beginning to fail from inadequate circulation, and his liver showed signs of congestion. Without a new heart, he had weeks at most. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Friday in November. A donor heart had become available, tissue matched to Michael with remarkable compatibility. The donor was a 38-year-old man named Vincent Shaw, who died in a motorcycle accident, his brain death confirmed but his organs still viable. Vincent's family had made the decision to donate, a choice that would give multiple recipients a chance at extended life. Evelyn assembled her team and began the meticulous process of transplant surgery. The operation proceeded flawlessly, her hands moving with the precision of long experience. Vincent Shaw's heart came out of cold storage, healthy and strong. Stopped but ready to beat again once connected to Michael Reeves's circulatory system. The anastomosis, the surgical connection of blood vessels, went perfectly. Evelyn sutured the donor heart into place, connecting arteries and veins with tiny, precise stitches. The heart sat in Michael's chest cavity, a foreign organ that would soon become integrated into his body through the miracle of modern immunosuppression. Then came the moment Evelyn always found profound, restarting the heart. Sometimes it began beating spontaneously once blood flow was restored. Sometimes it required electrical shock, a defibrillation to jumpstart the cardiac rhythm. This time, the heart began beating on its own the instant warm blood flowed through its chambers. But something was wrong. The rhythm was strong but irregular, not the normal sinus rhythm Evelyn expected, but something more chaotic. The monitors showed a pattern she'd never seen before, peaks and valleys that didn't match any textbook arrhythmia. Her team exchanged concerned glances, and the anesthesiologist reported that Michael's blood pressure was spiking dangerously high, then dropping precipitously, cycling between extremes. "Get me cardiology," Evelyn ordered. Not taking her eyes off the heart she could see directly in front of her, beating with an intensity that seemed almost violent. The organ contracted with such force that she could see Michael's entire chest moving with each beat. Dr. Raymond Foster, the hospital's senior cardiologist, arrived within minutes. He studied the monitor readings, his frown deepening. "That's not VT, not any kind of flutter or fibrillation I recognize," he said. "The electrical pattern is organized, but it's not normal sinus rhythm. It's like..." He paused, searching for words. "It's like the heart is beating to two different rhythms simultaneously." Evelyn made the decision to proceed with closing, reasoning that getting Michael off bypass and allowing his new heart to stabilize might resolve the irregular rhythm. She completed the surgery with meticulous care, closed the chest, and transferred Michael to the cardiac intensive care unit. Over the next 24 hours, Michael's condition stabilized, but the rhythm remained abnormal. He regained consciousness, seemed alert and oriented, showed no signs of rejection or surgical complications. But his heart continued its strange, doubled beat, and the monitors displayed patterns that made no medical sense. "How do you feel?" Evelyn asked during her post-operative check. Michael considered the question carefully. "Different," he finally said. "I feel crowded, like there's not enough room inside me." He placed his hand over his chest. "And I keep having these flashes of things I don't remember. Places I've never been, conversations I never had." Evelyn attributed this to the trauma of surgery and the effects of anesthesia, common enough experiences. But over the following days, Michael's reports became more specific and more disturbing. He described riding a motorcycle, though he'd never been on one in his life. He talked about a woman named Diane becoming agitated when told no one by that name was in his contacts or family. He complained of phantom pains in his left leg, though that leg was perfectly healthy. The symptoms might have been dismissed as post-transplant delirium, a known phenomenon except for what Evelyn discovered when she reviewed Vincent Shaw's donor file. Vincent had been an avid motorcyclist. His emergency contact was his wife, Diane Shaw, and his left leg had been badly injured in the accident, requiring amputation before his other organs could be harvested. Michael Reeves was experiencing memories that belonged to Vincent Shaw. Evelyn knew about cellular memory, the controversial theory that organs retained some imprint of their original owner, though most transplant surgeons dismissed it as pseudoscience. But what Michael was describing went far beyond vague personality changes. He was accessing specific, verifiable information he couldn't possibly know through any normal means. "Tell me about the motorcycle," Evelyn said during one of her visits to Michael's room. Michael's expression became distant. "It's a Harley, custom black paint with silver detailing. I can feel it, the weight of it, the vibration of the engine. I know exactly how to shift gears, how to lean into turns. I've never ridden a motorcycle, Dr. Marsh, but I know how to ride that specific bike like I've been doing it for years." "What else do you remember?" "Diane," Michael said, and there was longing in his voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own experience. "I miss her. I know that doesn't make sense, but I miss her like I've lost something essential. And there's anger, too, at someone named Rick. I don't know who Rick is, but when I think about him, I feel rage." Evelyn tracked down Diane Shaw and with appropriate medical discretion asked about Rick. Diane's face had gone pale. "Rick is Vincent's brother," she said. "They had a falling out years ago, stopped speaking. Vincent was still angry about it when he died. How could your patient possibly know that?" The transplant had somehow transferred more than just cardiac tissue. Vincent Shaw's memories, his emotions, his identity were encoded in the cells of his heart, and now they were bleeding into Michael Reeves's consciousness. The boundary between donor and recipient was breaking down. Michael's condition deteriorated psychologically as the memories intensified. He started speaking in ways that didn't match his previous personality, using phrases and expressions that had been characteristic of Vincent. He asked for foods he'd never liked before, all of them Vincent's favorites, according to Diane. He woke from nightmares of the motorcycle accident, experiencing Vincent's final moments in vivid detail. "I can't tell where I end and he begins," Michael confessed to Evelyn during a late-night visit when he couldn't sleep. "Sometimes I remember my life, teaching history at Lincoln High, my apartment, my friends. Other times those memories feel distant, like they belong to someone else, and Vincent's life is the real one. I remember his childhood, his first kiss, the day he met Diane. I remember dying on that highway, feeling the impact, knowing it was over." Evelyn consulted with neurologists, psychiatrists, even researchers who studied consciousness and identity. No one had a satisfactory explanation. The heart couldn't store memories, that was the brain's function. Yet somehow Michael was accessing information that had no rational pathway into his consciousness. The situation became more complex when Michael began to exhibit skills he'd never had before. He could fix motorcycles, a knowledge that came to him fully formed, Vincent's years of mechanical experience now residing in Michael's hands. He knew how to navigate parts of the city he'd never visited, following routes that Vincent had traveled regularly. He could speak conversational Spanish, though Michael had only studied French in school. Vincent had been fluent in Spanish, having grown up in a bilingual household. At 6 weeks post-transplant, Michael's physiological recovery was excellent. His new heart pumped strongly, his labs showed no signs of rejection, and his body had integrated the donated organ with remarkable success. But psychologically, he was fragmenting. The person who'd been Michael Reeves was being overwritten by the personality and memories of Vincent Shaw. "I want to meet her," Michael said one day, and Evelyn didn't need to ask who he meant. "Diane, I need to see her." Against her better medical judgment, Evelyn arranged the meeting, with appropriate psychological support present. Diane Shaw entered the hospital room, her expression guarded, grief still raw from losing her husband only 2 months earlier. Michael looked up at her, and his face transformed with recognition that was too deep, too genuine to be fabricated. "Dee," he said, using what Diane later confirmed was Vincent's private nickname for her. "God, I've missed you." They talked for an hour, and Evelyn watched as Michael demonstrated knowledge of intimate details of Vincent and Diane's relationship, private jokes and shared memories that no one else could have known. Diane cried, torn between grief and the impossible hope that some fragment of her husband had survived in this stranger's body. "Tell me something," Diane finally said. "Tell me something only Vincent would know. Something I've never told anyone else." Michael was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then he spoke. "The night we got engaged, you told me you were scared. Not of marrying me, but of losing me because you'd lost everyone else you ever loved. Your parents, your brother, all gone. You said you felt cursed, like everyone you loved was taken away. I promised you I'd live to be 100, that you'd get sick of me long before death could separate us." His voice broke. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep that promise." Diane's sob confirmed the truth. It was a conversation they'd had in complete privacy, never shared with anyone. Evelyn ordered every test she could think of, searching for a rational explanation. Genetic studies, neurological imaging, psychological evaluations, nothing revealed how Michael could possess Vincent's memories. The heart was just tissue, just muscle and valves and electrical pathways. It shouldn't be able to carry consciousness, shouldn't be able to transfer identity. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Over the following months, Michael Reeves slowly disappeared. The personality that emerged was neither entirely Michael nor entirely Vincent, but some hybrid entity that struggled with the contradictions of two lives merged into one body. He kept Michael's name but adopted many of Vincent's mannerisms. He maintained Michael's teaching job but pursued Vincent's love of motorcycles during his free time. He developed a relationship with Diane that was both new and ancient, built on memories he shouldn't have but couldn't deny. Evelyn documented everything but published nothing, knowing that the medical community would never accept what she'd witnessed. Cellular memory was considered fringe science, and what Michael experienced went far beyond even the most generous interpretations of that theory. This was something else entirely, something that suggested consciousness might not be as localized to the brain as science insisted. She began quietly researching other transplant cases, looking for similar reports. She found them, scattered through medical literature but always dismissed or explained away. Organ recipients who developed new food preferences, new skills, new memories that matched their donors. The phenomenon was rare but consistent enough to form a pattern, one that mainstream medicine refused to acknowledge. Michael's case raised profound questions about the nature of identity and consciousness. If memory and personality could be transferred through organ donation, what did that mean about the mind-body relationship? Where did consciousness actually reside? Was the heart more than just a pump, carrying some essential aspect of self in its cells? Evelyn had no answers, only observations that challenged everything she'd been taught. She continued her work as a transplant surgeon, but she approached each procedure differently now, with a new awareness that the organs she transplanted might carry more than just biological function. Each heart held a history, a life, experiences encoded in ways that science didn't yet understand. Michael Reeves lives with his merged identity, having learned to navigate the strange space between two lives. He sees Diane regularly, their relationship evolving into something neither romantic nor platonic, but sustained by the undeniable connection between them. He teaches history while maintaining Vincent's motorcycle in his garage. Two passions from two lives existing side by side. Evelyn still performs transplants, still saves lives through the gift of donated organs. But she's learned to respect the mystery of what she's transferring, to acknowledge that the exchange involves more than just tissue and blood. She warns her patients carefully and obliquely that they might experience changes they don't expect, that the heart they receive carries more than just the ability to circulate blood. The medical community continues to dismiss cellular memory as pseudoscience, and Evelyn keeps her observations private. Some truths are too challenging to existing paradigms, too threatening to the comfortable certainties of evidence-based medicine. But she knows what she witnessed in Michael Reeves, and she knows it wasn't unique. Every time she holds a donor heart in her hands now, she wonders whose memories she's about to transfer, what fragments of consciousness might survive in those cells. And she says a silent acknowledgement to the donor, a recognition that what she's carrying is more than just an organ. It's a piece of someone's self, about to merge with someone else's identity in ways that can never be completely predicted or controlled. The transplant succeeded in keeping Michael Reeves alive, but it also proved that death might not be quite as absolute as medicine claims, that some part of us survives in the organs we leave behind, waiting to wake up in a new body, carrying forward the memories and essence of a life that was supposed to have ended. Evelyn Marsh continues her work, continues her secret documentation, and continues to wonder about the true nature of consciousness and identity. And every time she sees Michael living his hybrid existence, she's reminded that there are mysteries in medicine that will never be fully understood, only witnessed and carefully guarded by those who know that some truths are too strange to speak aloud. Story number 5, The Night Rotation. Amanda Chen had just completed her nursing degree when she accepted a position in the geriatric psychiatric ward at Hillcrest Medical Facility, a sprawling institution on the outskirts of the city that specialized in treating elderly patients with severe dementia, Alzheimer's, and various other cognitive disorders. The pay was good, the benefits excellent, and the work, while emotionally challenging, offered the kind of hands-on patient care that Amanda had gone into nursing to provide. The ward housed 48 patients divided between 2 floors with staff rotating through day, evening, and night shifts. Amanda drew the night rotation for her first month, working from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., the quiet hours when most patients slept and the facility operated with minimal staff. It was considered the easiest shift for new nurses, a chance to learn the routines and patient needs without the chaos of day shift. Her orientation was conducted by Gloria Patterson, a veteran psychiatric nurse who'd worked at Hillcrest for 18 years. Gloria was thorough and professional, walking Amanda through protocols for medication administration, behavioral management, and emergency procedures. But at the end of the orientation, as they stood at the nurses' station in the dim hallway of the 2nd floor, Gloria added something that wasn't in the training manual. "There's one thing you need to know about night shift," Gloria said, her voice dropping. "The patients sometimes have what we call coordinated episodes. It doesn't happen every night, maybe once or twice a month, but when it does, you need to follow the protocol exactly." "What kind of episodes?" Amanda asked. "They wake up," Gloria said simply. "All of them at exactly the same time, usually around 3 in the morning. And they all do the same thing. They go to their doors and they knock. All 48 patients knocking on their doors simultaneously in perfect rhythm. It lasts for exactly 10 minutes and then they all go back to bed." Amanda waited for Gloria to smile, to indicate this was some kind of hazing ritual for new nurses. But Gloria's expression remained serious. "When it happens, you do not open any doors. You do not respond to the knocking. You stay at the nurses' station. You document the time and duration and you wait for it to end. Do you understand? What happens if you open a door? Amanda asked, trying to keep skepticism out of her voice. Gloria's eyes went distant. A nurse named Kelly tried that about 5 years ago. She thought one of the patients was in distress. She opened the door to room 214 and... Gloria paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. She saw something in that room that wasn't the patient. She wouldn't describe what it was, but she transferred to day shift immediately and quit within 2 weeks. We don't open doors during coordinated episodes. Amanda's first 2 weeks passed without incident. The night shift was indeed quiet, with most patients sleeping peacefully through the dark hours. She learned their names and histories. Harold, who'd been a professor of literature and now could barely speak. Margaret, who'd raised 6 children and now couldn't remember any of their names. Robert, who'd been a surgeon and now couldn't feed himself. Each patient represented a life diminished by the cruel progression of neurological disease. The coordinated episode happened on Amanda's 15th night. She was at the nurse's station updating charts when the ward's ambient noise suddenly changed. The usual random sounds, a patient coughing, someone talking in their sleep, the mechanical hum of medical equipment, all stopped simultaneously, leaving a silence so complete it felt oppressive. Amanda looked up at the clock. 3:04 a.m. Then the knocking began. Every door in the hallway, all 24 rooms on this floor, erupted with the sound of rhythmic knocking. Not frantic pounding or desperate beating, but measured, steady knocking, as if all 48 patients were following the same internal metronome. Knock, 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 pause, knock, 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 pause, perfect synchronization from dozens of individual sources. Amanda stood, her heart hammering, and looked down the hallway. In the dim emergency lighting, she could see nothing unusual, just closed doors and the steady, impossibly coordinated knocking. She pulled out her phone to check the time, 3:04 a.m., and to record the incident as Gloria had instructed. The sound was maddening in its precision. No variation in rhythm, no patient falling out of sync, just the relentless knocking that seemed to echo not just through the hallway, but inside Amanda's skull. She understood now why Gloria had been so serious. This wasn't normal patient behavior. Dementia patients didn't coordinate like this. They couldn't coordinate like this, not with their damaged neural pathways and deteriorated cognitive function. Amanda found herself drawn toward the hallway, wanting to look into one of the rooms to see what the patients were doing. The small windows in each door would allow her to observe without opening them. She took several steps away from the nurse's station before Gloria's warning echoed in her memory. Stay at the nurse's station, do not respond. She forced herself to return to her position, but the urge to investigate grew stronger. The knocking continued, relentless and perfectly timed. 4 minutes had passed. 6 more to go if Gloria's information was accurate. At 8 minutes, Amanda noticed something new. The knocking had developed a pattern, a rhythm that went beyond simple repetition. It was communicating something, though she couldn't decipher what. Knock, 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 pause, knock, knock, pause, knock. Some kind of code, perhaps, or language reduced to its most basic form. The dementia patients, whose brains were so damaged they could barely remember their own names, were using coordinated knocking to send a message. The implications made Amanda's skin crawl. If the patients could coordinate this precisely, their cognitive impairment wasn't as severe as their daytime behavior suggested. Or something else was controlling their actions, using them as instruments for a purpose Amanda couldn't fathom. At 9 minutes, Amanda saw movement at the far end of the hallway. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness seemed to slide along the wall, moving from door to door. It had no definable shape, just a presence that suggested mass and intention. The shadow paused at each door as if listening to the knocking before flowing to the next. Amanda wanted to run but found herself frozen, unable to look away from the shadow's progress down the hallway. It moved against the physics of light and form, existing in a way that didn't match any rational explanation. This was what Kelly had seen, she realized. This was what waited behind the doors during coordinated episodes. At exactly 10 minutes, the knocking stopped. All 48 patients ceased simultaneously, leaving silence that felt even more oppressive than the sound had been. The shadow at the end of the hallway dissolved, fading into the regular darkness as if it had never existed. Amanda's phone showed 3:14 a.m. She remained at the nurse's station for another hour, unable to calm her racing heart before finally making her rounds to check on the patients. Each room showed the same scene. An elderly patient sleeping peacefully in their bed, no sign of recent activity, no indication they'd been awake and knocking on their doors with impossible coordination. Amanda documented the incident in the shift log, using the clinical language Gloria had taught her. 0304-0314, coordinated patient behavior observed. Protocol followed. No adverse outcomes. Simple words that couldn't capture the profound wrongness of what she'd witnessed. She tried to rationalize it over the following days. Mass psychogenic illness, perhaps, where patients unconsciously mimicked each other's behavior. Sleep disorders that caused simultaneous wakening. Some artifact of the medication schedules that produced synchronized side effects. None of the explanations felt adequate. The second coordinated episode occurred 3 weeks later, and this time, Amanda was prepared with a video camera determined to document the phenomenon properly. But when she checked the recording afterward, the video showed only empty hallways and closed doors. The sound of knocking was present, but no visual confirmation of the patients creating it. The shadow she'd seen again was nowhere visible on the video, though she'd filmed it directly. Amanda began researching Hillcrest's history, spending her off days in the local library reviewing old newspapers and county records. The facility had been built in 1968 on land that had previously been undeveloped forest. No tragic history, no dark secrets in its past, just a modern medical facility treating patients with cognitive decline. But the patient records, which Amanda accessed through the medical database, showed something interesting. Every patient currently in the geriatric psychiatric ward had been admitted within the past 6 months. That was unusual for this type of facility, where patients typically stayed for years until death. She checked with Gloria, who confirmed that there'd been a mass transfer of patients 6 months ago when the ward underwent renovation. "What happened to the original patients?" Amanda asked. "The ones who were here before the renovation?" Gloria's expression became guarded. "They were transferred to other facilities. The renovation took 3 months, so they needed long-term placement elsewhere." "All of them?" "All of them," Gloria confirmed, but something in her tone suggested she wasn't telling the complete story. Amanda kept digging and found an obituary that made her blood run cold. 15 patients from Hillcrest had died in a transport accident during the renovation period. A bus carrying them to a temporary facility had crashed on the highway, killing everyone on board. The incident had been kept quiet, settled out of court with the families, barely making the local news. She counted the dates. The coordinated episodes had started exactly 1 week after the accident. Amanda confronted Gloria with what she'd learned. The older nurse listened quietly, then sighed. "I was hoping you wouldn't find that out," she said. "Yes, 15 patients died in that accident, and yes, the coordinated episodes started afterward. Some of the staff think, the knocking is them, the ones who died. They're still here somehow, still trying to communicate." "That's not possible," Amanda said, but her certainty wavered. She'd seen the shadow. She'd witnessed the impossible synchronization. Dementia patients can't coordinate like that. Their brains don't have the capacity. Exactly, Gloria said. The living patients aren't doing the knocking. They're being used to do it. The dead ones, they don't have bodies anymore, so they use the living patients as instruments. The knocking is their way of telling us they're still here. Amanda wanted to reject this explanation, to demand something scientific and rational. But she'd witnessed phenomena that had no rational explanation. The coordinated episodes defied every principle of neurology and behavior. Something was using the patients to communicate, and if the living patients couldn't coordinate such actions, then the force behind the knocking had to be external. "What do they want?" Amanda asked. "We don't know," Gloria admitted. "Maybe they don't know they're dead. Maybe they're confused, trying to get back to their rooms. Maybe they're trapped somehow and the knocking is them asking for help. We've tried bringing in mediums, priests, counselors. Nothing helps. The episodes continue." Over the following months, Amanda witnessed 6 more coordinated episodes. Each time she stayed at the nurse's station as instructed, documenting but not interfering. Each time she saw the shadow moving through the hallway, that presence that suggested the dead were indeed walking among the living patients. She began to recognize patterns in the knocking, sequences that repeated across episodes. It was a language, she became convinced, or at least an attempt at communication. The 15 dead patients were using the 48 living ones to speak, to tap out messages that no one had yet learned to understand. Amanda tried decoding the patterns, using various cipher systems and communication protocols. She made progress, identifying what seemed to be repeated phrases, structures that suggested syntax and grammar. The knocking wasn't random. It was speech, rendered in the most basic binary form. Sound and silence, rhythm and pause. She brought her findings to Gloria, who looked at the decoded patterns with something like fear. "Maybe we're not supposed to understand," Gloria said quietly. "Maybe the knocking is meant to remain mysterious. Do you really want to know what they're trying to say?" But Amanda couldn't let it go. She dedicated her career to caring for patients, to understanding their needs and providing comfort. If the dead patients were trying to communicate, she felt obligated to listen, to understand, to help if she could. The breakthrough came during the 7th coordinated episode Amanda witnessed. She'd learned enough of the pattern to anticipate the sequences, to follow the rhythm as it built toward something. And this time, standing in the hallway despite Gloria's protocol, she understood. The knocking wasn't asking for help. It wasn't expressing confusion or seeking release. It was a warning. "Get out, get out, get out," the rhythm said, repeated over and over in the binary language of sound and silence. "Leave before you stay, leave before you join, leave before you become." Amanda staggered back to the nurse's station, the decoded message echoing in her mind. The dead patients weren't trapped. They were trying to warn the living ones, trying to prevent more deaths from swelling their ranks. The facility itself was somehow wrong, somehow dangerous, and the 15 who died were trying to protect those who remained. She quit that night, submitted her resignation before her shift ended, and never returned to Hillcrest Medical Facility. Gloria accepted her resignation without surprise, with the weary recognition of someone who'd seen other nurses reach the same conclusion. Amanda found work at a different facility, never mentioning her experiences at Hillcrest in interviews or references. But she kept her decoded notes, her documentation of the coordinated episodes, her record of the warning the dead had tried to send. She learned later that Hillcrest was closed 18 months after she left, following a series of patient deaths that exceeded statistical norms even for a geriatric facility. The official explanation cited administrative failures and inadequate care protocols. The building was demolished, the land sold to developers who built condominiums on the site. Amanda sometimes drives past that location, looking at the modern apartments where the geriatric psychiatric ward once stood. She wonders if the new residents ever hear knocking at 3 in the morning, if the 15 dead patients are still trying to send their warning to anyone who'll listen. She wonders if some places become marked by tragedy, if death leaves an imprint that persists despite demolition and reconstruction. She knows that the coordinated episodes were real, that the dead had learned to communicate through the living, that something in that facility had been fundamentally wrong. She knows that she escaped something that could have claimed her, that the warning she decoded had been meant for the staff as much as for the patients. Amanda Chen continues her nursing career, continues to care for the elderly and cognitively impaired. But she's learned to recognize when something is wrong in ways that go beyond medical explanation, when a facility has an atmosphere that suggests danger lurking beneath routine operations. She's learned to listen to warnings that come in unusual forms, to trust her instincts when they scream that something is profoundly amiss. And every time she hears unexpected knocking, her heart races with the memory of those coordinated episodes, those impossibly synchronized rhythms that carried a message from the dead to the living, a warning that some had heeded and others had ignored, written in the most basic language of all. Sound breaking the silence, pattern emerging from chaos, the dead refusing to stay quiet. The knocking continues somewhere, Amanda is certain. Different facility, different patients, same warning being tapped out in darkness. And she hopes that someone else will learn to decode it, will understand in time to escape, will listen to the dead who are trying, in their limited way, to protect the living from whatever claimed them. Story number 6, the pediatric ward. Lauren Vasquez had been a pediatric oncology nurse for 6 years. At Children's Memorial Hospital, a state-of-the-art facility specializing in the treatment of childhood cancers and serious blood disorders. It was emotionally exhausting work, caring for children facing diseases that should never touch the young. But Lauren found profound meaning in bringing comfort to her patients and their families during the most difficult period of their lives. The hospital's layout reflected its specialized focus, with the pediatric oncology ward occupying the entire 5th floor. Patient rooms lined both sides of a central corridor, each room decorated with bright colors and cheerful artwork designed to make the space less clinical, more welcoming. A large playroom at the center of the ward provided space for mobile patients to interact, play, and briefly forget they were in a hospital. Lauren's schedule rotated between day and night shifts, giving her comprehensive exposure to the ward's rhythms and patterns. She learned each patient's story, their diagnosis and prognosis, their hopes and fears. Children like 7-year-old Emma, fighting leukemia with fierce determination. 10-year-old Marcus, whose bone cancer had required amputation but who somehow maintained incredible optimism. 5-year-old Sarah, whose neuroblastoma had spread despite aggressive treatment, her time now measured in weeks rather than months. The phenomenon Lauren came to think of as the gathering began with Sarah. It was a Tuesday evening around 8 o'clock when Lauren entered Sarah's room to administer medications and found the child awake and alert, staring at the corner of her room with intense focus. Sarah had been declining steadily, her pain increasing, her lucid periods becoming shorter. But tonight she seemed unusually aware, her eyes tracking something Lauren couldn't see. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" Lauren asked gently. "The other children," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They come to visit at night. They tell me stories about where they're going." Lauren felt a chill despite the room's comfortable temperature. Other nurses had mentioned that terminally ill children sometimes reported seeing deceased relatives or mysterious visitors in their final days, a phenomenon that skeptics attributed to medication effects or oxygen deprivation to the brain. But Sarah's clarity in that moment suggested something beyond confused hallucinations. "What do the children tell you?" Lauren asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "They say it doesn't hurt where they are," Sarah explained. "They say they're waiting for me, that we'll all play together. There's a boy named Michael who says he had the same kind of sick as me, and a girl named Jessica who wants to show me her garden." Lauren checked Sarah's chart later and felt her breath catch. The pediatric oncology ward had lost a patient named Michael 4 months ago to neuroblastoma, the same cancer Sarah had. She didn't remember a Jessica, but the hospital's patient database confirmed that a girl by that name had died in this ward 3 years earlier. Children who died in this ward were appearing to current patients. Over the following weeks, Lauren began documenting these reports more carefully. She discovered that other nurses had noticed the pattern but dismissed it as coincidence or imagination. Children facing death often developed rich fantasy lives, finding comfort in imagined friends. The fact that these friends sometimes shared names with deceased patients was curious but not necessarily significant. But then Lauren witnessed something that couldn't be explained away. It was 3 a.m. on a Thursday during one of Lauren's night shifts. She was at the nurse's station completing documentation when she heard laughter coming from the playroom. This wasn't particularly unusual. Some children couldn't sleep and would play quietly in the night. But the quality of the laughter made Lauren pause. It sounded like many children, more than the 3 patients currently mobile enough to leave their beds. Lauren walked to the playroom and looked through the window in the door. Inside, she saw approximately 15 children playing together, running between the toys and furniture, their laughter bright and joyful. But she could only identify 3 of them as current patients. The others were unfamiliar children she didn't recognize from the ward census. She opened the door to investigate, and the scene changed instantly. The room was empty except for Emma, who sat alone on the floor with a puzzle, looking up at Lauren with curious eyes. "Did you need something, Miss Lauren?" the girl asked. "I thought I heard other children in here," Lauren said, scanning the room for places where kids might be hiding. But the playroom was open plan with nowhere to conceal more than a dozen children. "Oh, the night friends," Emma said casually. "They were here a minute ago, but they left when you came. They're shy around grown-ups." "Who are the night friends?" Lauren asked, sitting down next to Emma. "Kids who used to be in the hospital," Emma explained. "They come back at night to play with us. They're nice. They tell us stories about what happens after we don't get better." Lauren's documented reports of these encounters grew extensive over the following months. Approximately 70% of the ward's patients reported seeing other children or night friends at some point during their stay. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Children wearing hospital gowns or pajamas, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, who appeared primarily during evening and night hours. Most disturbing was what happened when Lauren cross-referenced the descriptions with the ward's historical records. Patients described children whose physical appearances, names, and even specific diagnoses matched those of children who had died in the ward over its 23-year history. A boy with a burn scar on his left arm, matching Timothy, who died in a hospital fire in 2004. A girl with distinctive red hair and freckles, matching Christine, who'd succumbed to lymphoma in 2011. On and on, detail after detail that living patients had no way of knowing. The children who saw these visitors reacted with surprising calm, even comfort. Unlike the distress that might be expected from hallucinations or frightening visions, the patients seemed to find solace in the presence of the night friends. Those who'd been anxious about death often became more peaceful after their encounters, accepting their prognosis with a maturity beyond their years. Lauren struggled with how to interpret this information. As a nurse trained in evidence-based medicine, she wanted rational explanations. Mass hallucination, coincidental similarities, or perhaps some way that patients learned about previous cases and incorporated that information into their visions. but the evidence didn't support those theories. The details were too specific, too accurate, too consistent across patients who had no contact with each other or access to historical ward information. The phenomenon reached a critical point with Marcus. The 10-year-old's bone cancer had returned despite aggressive treatment, metastasizing to his lungs and liver. His prognosis was now terminal, with perhaps days remaining. Marcus had faced his diagnosis with remarkable courage throughout his treatment, but as death approached, he became increasingly frightened, crying at night and clinging to his mother with desperate strength. Then one evening, Marcus's entire demeanor changed. Lauren found him sitting up in bed, smiling, his fear apparently vanished. His mother sat beside him, looking confused but relieved by the transformation. "They came," Marcus told Lauren. "All of them. There must have been 20 kids in my room, all different ages. They told me everything's okay, that dying doesn't hurt like being sick does. There's a boy named David who had bone cancer like me. He said he'd be there when I cross over, that he'd help me understand." Lauren checked the records. David Martinez, aged 9, had died of osteosarcoma 4 years ago. His patient room had been where Marcus's room was now located. Over his final 3 days, Marcus reported ongoing visits from the children, describing elaborate conversations and interactions. He told his mother about the other side, as the night friends had described it, a place without pain or sickness where children could run and play without limitations. His fear evaporated completely, replaced by a calm acceptance that brought peace to his family despite their grief. Marcus died on a Saturday morning, his passing gentle and peaceful. Lauren was present, holding his hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped. And in that moment she felt something in the room shift, a presence that hadn't been there before, as if the space had become crowded with invisible observers. Emma, in the room next door, later told Lauren she'd seen Marcus leave. "The night friends came for him," she explained. "They were so happy to see him. They all went down the hallway together toward the bright place." Marcus was smiling. Lauren began to think of the ward differently after that, not just as a medical facility, but as a liminal space where the boundary between life and death was perhaps more permeable than in other places. The children who died here didn't completely leave. They remained in some form, reaching back across that boundary to comfort those who were following the same path. She shared her documentation with the hospital's chaplain, a wise woman named Reverend Martens, who'd provided spiritual care to patients and families for 15 years. Reverend Martens listened carefully, reviewed Lauren's notes, and nodded with recognition. "I have observed this too," the chaplain confirmed. "I call them the witness children. They seem to serve a purpose, helping the dying transition with less fear. Some cultures and spiritual traditions have long believed that the dead assist the dying, that crossing over isn't something we do alone. Perhaps that's particularly true for children who need companionship and guidance even in death. But not all encounters with the witness children were comforting." Lauren discovered this when 12-year-old Olivia was admitted to the ward with recently diagnosed acute myeloid leukemia. Olivia's case was challenging but not immediately terminal. She had reasonable odds of remission with aggressive chemotherapy. Yet from her first night in the ward, Olivia reported seeing the other children and being deeply disturbed by their presence. "They keep telling me I'm going to join them," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "They say I'll die here, that the treatment won't work. I don't want to see them anymore. Please make them go away." Lauren tried to comfort Olivia, explaining the phenomenon as kindly as possible, but the girl's distress only increased. The witness children appeared to Olivia constantly, day and night, more persistently than they visited other patients. They showed her around the ward, pointing out where various children had died, describing their final moments in detail that traumatized Olivia. Why are they doing this? Olivia asked Lauren through tears. Why won't they leave me alone? Lauren had no answer. The witness children had always been benign before, even helpful. Their aggressive focus on Olivia represented a disturbing deviation from the pattern. Olivia's treatment progressed poorly. She developed complications that shouldn't have occurred, infections that defied antibiotic treatment, reactions to medications that were statistically unlikely. Her medical team was baffled by the cascade of problems that pushed her toward critical condition despite their best efforts. 3 weeks after admission, Olivia pulled Lauren aside during a lucid moment. "They told me something," she whispered. "The other children, they said I'm not supposed to leave. They said the hospital needs me here, that I'm meant to join them. I don't understand what that means." Lauren felt cold dread settle in her chest. The witness children weren't just comforting the dying, they were, in some incomprehensible way, recruiting. They wanted Olivia to join their ranks, and her body was responding to that call despite medical intervention. Lauren considered telling the medical team about the phenomenon, recommending psychiatric consultation or even transfer to another facility. But she knew how it would sound. A nurse claiming that ghosts of dead children were somehow causing a patient's decline. She'd lose credibility, possibly her job, and Olivia would still be trapped in whatever was happening. Instead, Lauren tried a different approach. She spent as much time as possible in Olivia's room, her presence seeming to diminish the witness children's activity. She spoke to them directly, feeling foolish but desperate, asking them to leave Olivia alone, to let her have a chance at life. "She's not ready," Lauren said to the empty corners of Olivia's room during night shift. "She has too much time left, too much life to live. Please leave her alone." She didn't expect a response, but Olivia reported a change. "They're arguing," the girl said. "Some of them want me to stay alive, to get better. They're fighting with the others who want me to join them. It's like they're having a war over me." Olivia's condition stabilized, then slowly began to improve. The complications resolved, the infections cleared, and her body finally responded to treatment as it should have from the beginning. The witness children's appearances became less frequent, their messages less insistent. After 6 weeks, Olivia achieved remission and was eventually discharged. Lauren visited Olivia during a follow-up appointment 2 months later. The girl was healthy, her color good, showing no signs of the disease that had nearly claimed her. "I don't see them anymore," Olivia said. "The other children. They stopped coming after I left the hospital." "Do you think they're still there?" "Yes," Lauren said quietly. "I think they are." Lauren continues to work in the pediatric oncology ward, continues to document encounters with the witness children, continues to wonder about the nature of what she's observed. She's learned that most children find comfort in these visitors, that the phenomenon seems to ease the transition from life to death. But she's also learned that the boundary between worlds isn't always friendly, that the dead sometimes have agendas that don't align with the living's best interests. The ward administration knows about the reports, though they don't officially acknowledge them. Parents are quietly warned that children in the ward sometimes report seeing other kids who aren't currently patients, that these visions are common and generally not cause for concern. Staff members learn to navigate around the phenomenon, to respect it without fully understanding it. Lauren has developed her own theory, unscientific and unprovable, based on years of observation. She believes the children who die in the ward remain connected to the place, bound by their experiences and perhaps by their youth, not yet ready or able to move on completely. They form a community of sorts, a collective of child spirits who find purpose in helping others facing the same journey they've already completed. Most of the time, this is benign, even beneficial. But occasionally their community seeks to grow, to add new members who aren't quite ready to join. The Olivia case taught Lauren that the witness children aren't simply passive observers but active participants with their own motivations and desires. She's learned to act as a mediator of sorts, communicating with the witness children on behalf of her patients, negotiating boundaries and requesting protection for those who aren't ready to die. It's strange work, operating in the space between medicine and something else entirely, but Lauren has accepted it as part of her role. The pediatric oncology ward continues its work, treating children with life-threatening illnesses, celebrating remissions and mourning deaths. And through it all, the witness children maintain their presence, invisible to most but deeply felt by those approaching death. They gather in playrooms after midnight, their laughter echoing through empty hallways. They sit beside frightened patients in the dark hours before dawn, offering comfort that the living cannot provide. Lauren Vasquez knows they're there, has learned to coexist with them, has even come to appreciate their role in easing suffering. But she never forgets that they're not entirely benevolent, that the dead have their own needs and wants that sometimes conflict with the living's. She remains vigilant, protective of her patients, aware that she works in a place where two worlds overlap and where not all the children in the ward are still alive. The boundary is thin here, maintained by nothing more than breath and heartbeat. And Lauren has learned that some children refuse to leave the ward even after death, finding purpose in remaining connected to a place of suffering and hope, of endings and sometimes miraculous new beginnings. They are the watchers, the witnesses, the other children who never quite went home. Story number 7. The Surgical Wing. Dr. Marcus Holloway had been an anesthesiologist at Regional Medical Center for 9 years, a job that required absolute precision and unwavering attention to detail. He was responsible for keeping patients safely unconscious during surgical procedures, for monitoring their vital signs, for ensuring they experienced no pain or awareness while surgeons worked on their bodies. It was high-stakes work where the margin for error was microscopic, and Marcus had earned a reputation for reliability and competence. Regional Medical Center's surgical wing consisted of 12 operating rooms, a recovery area, and extensive support facilities. The wing operated around the clock, with emergency surgeries occurring at all hours and scheduled procedures filling the day shift. Marcus typically worked 8 to 6 shifts, sometimes extending into evening if complex cases ran long. The anomaly began in Operating Room 7, though Marcus didn't immediately recognize it as such. He was assigned to a routine gallbladder removal, a laparoscopic cholecystectomy that should have taken 90 minutes start to finish. The patient was a 47-year-old woman named Patricia Morrison, generally healthy apart from the gallbladder issues that had brought her to surgery. Marcus reviewed her chart carefully, noting no red flags in her medical history, no allergies or previous complications that would suggest problems. The induction went smoothly. Marcus administered the standard cocktail of medications: propofol for sedation, fentanyl for pain control, rocuronium for muscle relaxation. Patricia's consciousness faded within seconds, her breathing taken over by the ventilator, all vitals stable and within normal parameters. 10 minutes into the procedure, Marcus noticed something strange on the EEG monitor that tracked Patricia's brain activity. The anesthetic should have produced a pattern of slow waves indicating deep unconsciousness. Instead, he was seeing occasional bursts of higher frequency activity, brief spikes that suggested conscious awareness. Marcus increased the propofol dosage, ensuring adequate depth of anesthesia. The spikes diminished but didn't completely disappear. He watched carefully, checking all his equipment, confirming that his medications were being delivered properly. Everything appeared normal except for those occasional bursts of brain activity that shouldn't be occurring. The surgery concluded successfully, and Marcus reversed the anesthesia, bringing Patricia back to consciousness. Her emergence was textbook normal, confused and groggy at first, then gradually clearing as the medications wore off. Marcus asked the standard questions about pain and nausea, received the expected responses, and transferred Patricia to recovery. 2 hours later, Patricia was alert enough for a more detailed assessment. The recovery nurse reported that the patient was doing well, but Patricia had made some odd comments about dreaming during surgery. Marcus went to investigate. "I know I was asleep," Patricia told him, her voice still, slightly slurred from residual medication effects. "But I could hear things. Not clearly, like listening through water or from far away. I heard the surgeon talking about something he needed, heard metal sounds, heard music playing. And I saw things, but not with my eyes, like I was floating above the table watching you all work on me." Awareness during anesthesia was one of Marcus's deepest professional fears, a rare but catastrophic failure of his job. Patients who experienced awareness could suffer profound psychological trauma, feeling pain or paralysis while unable to move or communicate. But Patricia's description didn't quite match classic awareness cases. She reported no pain, no panic, just a strange sense of observing the procedure from outside her body. "Can you describe what you saw?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his tone neutral and reassuring. Patricia detailed the operating room layout, the positions of staff members, even specific conversations she shouldn't have been able to hear. Her descriptions were accurate, verified when Marcus checked with the surgical team. She'd experienced something during the procedure, some form of consciousness or perception that had penetrated the anesthetic barrier. Marcus documented the case meticulously, reporting it through the hospital's adverse events system. An investigation was launched, examining his anesthetic technique, equipment function, and drug quality. Everything checked out. Marcus had done nothing wrong. There was no explanation for why Patricia had experienced awareness. But the phenomenon continued. Over the following weeks, Marcus noticed that patients undergoing surgery in Operating Room 7 reported unusual experiences with concerning frequency. Not every patient, but roughly 1 in 5, far higher than the normal awareness rate of 1 or 2 per thousand. They described similar sensations: hearing surgical team conversations, perceiving the operating room from unusual angles, feeling detached from their bodies. Marcus started requesting different operating rooms when possible, but scheduling demands often placed him in OR 7. Each time he found himself hyper-vigilant, increasing anesthetic dosages beyond normal levels, watching the EEG constantly for signs of awareness. Yet the reports continued. Patients in OR 7 experienced something that patients in other operating rooms did not. He began investigating the operating room's history and discovered something that made his blood run cold. OR 7 had been the site of a malpractice case 3 years earlier, before Marcus had joined the hospital staff. An anesthesiologist named Dr. Kenneth Sharp had been responsible for a patient who'd experienced full awareness during a major abdominal surgery. Feeling every incision, every manipulation of organs, unable to scream or move due to the paralytic drugs in his system. The patient, William Torres, had sued the hospital and Dr. Sharp, eventually settling for an undisclosed amount. The trauma of the experience had left Torres with severe PTSD, requiring years of psychiatric treatment. Dr. Sharp had faced medical board review, been censured for deviations from standard care, and had left Regional Medical Center shortly after the incident. He'd committed suicide 8 months later, his family claiming the malpractice case and loss of reputation had destroyed him. Marcus felt sick as he read through the case details. He'd never met Dr. Sharp, but the tragedy of the situation was overwhelming. A mistake, whether due to error, equipment failure, or bad luck, had destroyed multiple lives: the patient who suffered, the doctor who couldn't live with what happened, and the families affected by both traumas. and now something in OR7 seemed to be replaying that awareness, inflicting it on subsequent patients in a milder but still disturbing form. Marcus tried raising his concerns with Surgical Services Administration, explaining the pattern of awareness reports from OR7. The administration listened politely but remained skeptical. "We've had the room thoroughly inspected," the director told him. "All equipment is functioning properly. There's no physical reason for increased awareness. Perhaps you're being overly cautious with your anesthetic dosing, not maintaining adequate depth." But Marcus knew that wasn't the issue. He was providing appropriate anesthesia. Something in that room was interfering with the expected effect, creating a pathway for consciousness to persist despite the medications. He started documenting everything about his OR7 cases: exact drug dosages, timing of administration, EEG readings, equipment serial numbers. He wanted objective data that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or over-interpretation. The pattern became undeniable. Awareness experiences occurred almost exclusively in OR7, regardless of which anesthesiologist was involved, which surgeon performed the procedure, or which type of surgery was being done. The situation escalated when a patient named Gregory Michaels underwent surgery in OR7 for repair of a torn rotator cuff. Gregory experienced not just awareness, but specifically experienced William Torres's awareness, the original case from 3 years earlier. He reported feeling abdominal surgery despite undergoing shoulder surgery, experienced the terror and pain that Torres had endured, even described conversations from the original surgical team that Gregory had no way of knowing. Marcus reviewed Gregory's case file with growing horror. The man had undergone shoulder surgery but described with perfect accuracy details of Torres's abdominal surgery 3 years earlier. It was as if the room had recorded that traumatic event and was now replaying it for subsequent patients, overwriting their actual surgical experiences with Torres's nightmare. Marcus knew he was dealing with something beyond medical explanation. The room had been marked by suffering, by the patient's agony, and perhaps by Dr. Sharp's guilt and shame. That trauma had somehow soaked into the physical space, creating an echo that affected everyone who entered while unconscious and vulnerable. He tried to get OR7 permanently closed, presenting his documentation to administration, to the surgical staff committee, to anyone who would listen. But closing an operating room meant significant financial and operational costs. Without a clear physical defect, administration was unwilling to take a room out of service based on what they considered superstition. "We're a hospital, not a paranormal investigation unit," the chief of surgery told Marcus. "If you can't work comfortably in all our operating rooms, perhaps you should consider whether this is the right institution for you." Marcus felt trapped. He couldn't refuse assignments to OR7 without jeopardizing his position, but he also couldn't continue subjecting patients to the room's strange effects. He tried a different approach: ritual. He began performing a small ceremony before each surgery in OR7, privately acknowledging William Torres's suffering and Dr. Sharp's tragedy. He spoke quietly to the empty room before patients arrived, expressing regret for what had happened, asking that subsequent patients be spared the echo of that trauma. He felt foolish doing it, like a medieval doctor waving incense to ward off evil humors, but he was desperate. The ceremonies seemed to help, at least marginally. The awareness reports didn't stop, but their intensity decreased. Patients still experienced unusual sensations during surgery, but fewer reported the full horror of Torres's experience. It was as if Marcus's acknowledgement of the trauma had lessened its power, though not eliminated it entirely. Then Marcus had an idea that seemed both inspired and insane: bring William Torres back to OR7. He tracked down Torres through hospital records and made contact, explaining carefully who he was and why he was calling. Torres was understandably hesitant to engage with anything related to Regional Medical Center, but he agreed to meet Marcus for coffee. Torres was a haunted man, his eyes carrying the weight of his traumatic experience. He described the awareness in vivid detail, the helplessness and agony, the feeling of being trapped in a paralyzed body while experiencing surgical pain. He'd had suicidal ideation in the months following the surgery, his life derailed by a medical error that should never have happened. Marcus explained what he'd observed in OR7, the ongoing reports of awareness, the specific cases where patients experienced Torres's surgery rather than their own. Torres listened in silence, his expression cycling through disbelief, horror, and finally a strange kind of recognition. "I've dreamed about that room constantly since it happened," Torres said quietly. "Not just nightmares about the surgery, but dreams where I'm in the room watching other surgeries happen, seeing other patients on the table. I thought it was just PTSD, my mind fixating on the trauma. But what if I'm actually there somehow? What if part of me stayed in that room, reliving it over and over?" Marcus proposed something unorthodox. Torres would return to OR7 not as a patient but as a visitor. They would go together during off hours when no surgeries were scheduled. Torres would confront the space, speak to whatever echo of his trauma remained there, try to release both himself and the room from the cycle of repeated suffering. Torres agreed, though Marcus could see the man shaking as they made plans. They entered OR7 at midnight on a Thursday, the surgical wing quiet and empty. Marcus had obtained permission to access the room for equipment testing, a harmless lie that got them past security. The operating room looked normal under the bright surgical lights, sterile surfaces, organized equipment, nothing unusual or threatening. But Torres's reaction was immediate and visceral. He began shaking, his breath coming in short gasps, his face going pale. "It's exactly the same," he whispered. "Even the smell, that antiseptic smell, and I can feel it. That's where the table was, that's where they stood, that's where I—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood. Torres was experiencing the room not as it appeared now, but as it had been during his surgery, overlaid with sensory memories that were overwhelming him. "Tell it you're still here," Marcus encouraged. "Tell it you survived, that you're more than what happened to you in this room." Torres approached the center of the room where the operating table would be positioned during surgeries. He stood there, trembling, and began to speak. At first his voice was barely audible, but it gradually strengthened. "I'm William Torres," he said. "I was hurt here, but I survived. What happened to me was terrible, but it doesn't define me. I'm not just a victim, not just a trauma. I'm alive, I'm healing, and I'm letting go of this place. Dr. Sharp, wherever you are, I forgive you. It wasn't entirely your fault, and you didn't deserve what happened to you. And to whatever part of me stayed in this room reliving that day, I'm taking you home now. We're leaving together." Marcus felt something shift in the room, a change in atmosphere that he couldn't quite articulate. The air felt lighter somehow, less oppressive. Torres took a deep breath and seemed to physically relax, as if releasing weight he'd been carrying for years. They left OR7 together, and Marcus noticed Torres walked differently, with more confidence and less of the haunted wariness he'd exhibited before. "Thank you," Torres said simply. "I needed that more than I realized." In the weeks following that midnight visit, the awareness reports from OR7 dropped dramatically. Patients no longer described experiencing other surgeries or perceiving the operating room from outside their bodies. The EEG anomalies Marcus had been seeing disappeared. The room functioned normally, indistinguishable from the other operating rooms in the surgical wing. Marcus continued his work as an anesthesiologist, continued his mission of keeping patients safely unconscious during their most vulnerable moments. But he'd learned something profound about trauma and space, about how suffering can imprint itself on physical locations and affect subsequent occupants. He'd also learned that some healing requires confrontation, requires the wounded to return to the site of their injury and reclaim it from the trauma. Torres had done that, and in doing so had released both himself and the operating room from a cycle of repeated suffering. Marcus still thinks about OR7 sometimes, about the mysteries of consciousness and anesthesia, about the thin line between waking and sleeping, living and dying. He's learned that his job involves more than just monitoring vital signs and administering medications. It involves navigating the strange territories of human consciousness, those liminal spaces where the boundaries between self and other, past and present, become permeable. William Torres recovered more fully after that midnight visit, his PTSD symptoms gradually diminishing. He returned to a fuller life, no longer completely defined by his surgical trauma, and OR7 became just another operating room, its dark history acknowledged and released, its space reclaimed for the healing work hospitals are meant to do. But Marcus never forgets the lesson, that places can remember suffering, that trauma leaves echoes that affect subsequent occupants, and that sometimes the only way to break those cycles is to face them directly with acknowledgement, forgiveness, and conscious release. Some hauntings aren't supernatural. They're psychological, emotional imprints that persist until properly addressed. And in a hospital where trauma occurs daily, where people suffer and die and occasionally experience medical errors, those imprints are inevitable. The question is whether staff members have the awareness to recognize them and the courage to address them, or whether they dismiss the strange reports as coincidence and imagination, allowing the cycles of suffering to continue indefinitely. Marcus chose awareness and action, and OR7 became a testament to what's possible when medical professionals acknowledge that healing involves more than just physical intervention. Sometimes it requires dealing with the unseen wounds, the persistent echoes of suffering that lodge themselves in spaces and wait for someone brave enough to address them. Story number 8. The long-term care facility. Emma Rodriguez had worked in healthcare for 22 years when she accepted the position as night shift supervisor at Willowbrook. Extended care, a long-term nursing facility specializing in patients requiring continuous medical support for chronic conditions. These weren't the short-stay rehabilitation patients common in many nursing homes, but individuals with severe disabilities, advanced neurological diseases, or persistent vegetative states requiring full-time care with no expectation of improvement or discharge. Willowbrook housed 83 patients across 3 wings, with Emma's responsibilities covering all units during the overnight hours from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The facility operated with reduced staffing at night, 6 nursing assistants, 2 LPNs, and Emma as the supervising RN, relying on the fact that most patients required minimal active intervention during sleeping hours. The facility's architecture dated to the 1970s, a single-story structure built in a sprawling H shape with patient rooms lining long corridors that met at a central nurses' station. The building had been renovated twice, updating medical equipment and modernizing common areas, but its basic layout remained unchanged. Long hallways, minimal natural light, and the institutional smell of antiseptic and age that characterized all such facilities. Emma's orientation was conducted by Harold Simmons, the retiring night shift supervisor who'd held the position for 14 years. Harold was thorough, walking Emma through medication protocols, emergency procedures, and the specific needs of each patient. But on Emma's 3rd night of orientation, Harold added something that wasn't in any manual. "There's a phenomenon here," Harold said carefully, "that you need to know about. Around 2 a.m., you'll sometimes hear a patient calling for help from Wing C. The voice is always female, always sounds distressed. You'll check every room and every patient will be fine. Asleep, stable. No one in distress. But the calling continues, moving between rooms as if the person is wandering. Emma frowned. A confused patient leaving her room? That happens in facilities like this. No, Harold said firmly. All our Wing C patients are completely immobile. Multiple sclerosis, advanced ALS, locked-in syndrome, persistent vegetative states. None of them can speak, let alone call for help. Yet you'll hear it clearly coming from different rooms, always the same voice, always asking for someone to please help her. What causes it? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew where this was going. A patient named Margaret Donovan died here 8 years ago, Harold explained. She had advanced multiple sclerosis, was nonverbal and paralyzed in the final months of her life. On the night she died, she somehow regained the ability to speak just for a few minutes. She called for help repeatedly, asking for someone to find her, saying she was lost and couldn't see. The night shift nurse that evening was dealing with an emergency in another wing and didn't respond immediately. By the time someone checked on Margaret, she'd passed away. Harold paused, his expression troubled. Ever since then, you'll hear her calling. Always around 2 a.m., always the same words. Please help me, I can't see, I'm lost. Please, someone find me. The staff who've been here long enough just document it in the log and continue their work. There's nothing to be done. Margaret's looking for help that comes too late, over and over. Emma's first week passed without incident, and she began to think Harold's story was an elaborate hazing ritual for new supervisors. The facility ran smoothly with the usual minor complications of long-term care. Occasional medication adjustments, managing a patient's elevated temperature, dealing with equipment alarms. Nothing unusual, nothing supernatural. Then, on her 8th night, Emma heard it. She was at the central nurses' station reviewing charts when a woman's voice echoed down the Wing C hallway. Please help me. I can't see, I'm lost. The voice was clear but somehow distant, as if coming from far away despite seeming to originate nearby. Emma stood immediately and walked toward Wing C, her training overriding any hesitation. Someone needed help, and responding was her job. Please, someone find me. The voice seemed to come from room C14. Emma hurried there and found the room's occupant, a man named Stephen with advanced ALS, sleeping peacefully. His ventilator breathing for him with mechanical precision. No woman, no source for the voice. I can't see where I am. Now the voice came from C19. Emma went there and found that patient, a woman named Dorothy in a persistent vegetative state, still and silent, her condition unchanged. Emma checked the hallway, the common areas, everywhere someone might be wandering. The wing was empty except for the immobile patients in their beds. Please help me. The voice moved again, now seeming to come from C07. Emma followed, checking each room, finding every patient stable and quiet. Yet the calling continued, that female voice repeating its desperate plea, always just out of reach, always leading Emma from one room to the next. After 20 minutes, the voice faded away, leaving only the normal sounds of the facility. Breathing, machines humming, the occasional rustle of sheets. Emma stood in the empty hallway, her heart pounding, and understood that Harold's story had been true. Margaret Donovan was still here, still calling for help that would never arrive in time. Emma documented the incident in the supervisor's log, finding numerous similar entries from previous nights stretching back years. 02140236, auditory phenomenon in Wing C. All patients checked and stable, no source identified. Entry after entry, the same words with slight variations, a paper trail of the strange haunting that Willowbrook's night staff had learned to accept. Over the following weeks, Emma heard Margaret's calling multiple times, always following the same pattern. Beginning around 2 a.m., lasting 15 to 30 minutes, moving between rooms as Emma searched. She learned to recognize the rhythm of it, the specific rooms where the voice seemed strongest, the path it followed through the wing. But Margaret's calling wasn't the only phenomenon at Willowbrook. Emma discovered that Wing A had its own strangeness. Room A23 maintained a temperature consistently 10 degrees colder than the surrounding rooms, despite repeated checks by maintenance finding nothing wrong with the heating system. Staff members avoided entering A23 when possible, reporting feelings of intense sadness and oppression when they did. Wing B had what the nursing assistants called the walker, a presence that moved through the hallway between midnight and 1 a.m. Staff members would see a shadow moving at the edge of their vision, hear footsteps when no one was walking, feel someone pass by them in the empty corridor. The walker never interacted with anyone, never caused problems, just made its nightly rounds like a phantom staff member checking on patients. Emma researched Willowbrook's history and found that, like most long-term care facilities, it had seen hundreds of deaths over its decades of operation. People came here to live out their final months or years, declining gradually until their bodies finally gave out. The facility was saturated with endings, with loss, with the slow fade of human consciousness into nothing. Perhaps it was inevitable that some of that would linger. The phenomenon Emma found most disturbing involved a patient named Richard Moss, a 53-year-old man in a persistent vegetative state following a catastrophic stroke. Richard had been at Willowbrook for 6 years, maintained on feeding tubes and basic care, his body alive but his higher brain functions destroyed. He breathed, his heart beat, his body metabolized food, but there was no consciousness, no awareness, no person left in the shell that continued its biological functions. Except during the hours between 3 and 4 a.m., Richard's monitors occasionally showed unusual activity. Emma first noticed it during a routine check. Richard's room had an EEG monitor that tracked his basic brain activity, primarily used to detect seizures. The pattern should have been relatively flat, showing minimal electrical activity consistent with his vegetative state. But that night between 3:14 and 3:47 a.m., Richard's EEG showed bursts of organized activity, not seizures but patterns that suggested conscious thought. Emma watched in real time as Richard's brain seemed to wake up, producing electrical signatures that indicated he was thinking, processing information, perhaps even aware. His eyes remained closed, his body still, no visible change in his condition. But his brain was doing something it wasn't supposed to be capable of. The activity ceased at 3:47, dropping back to the expected baseline pattern. Emma reviewed Richard's historical EEG data and found this occurred regularly, several times per week, always during that same hour, always resolving on its own. She showed the data to Willowbrook's medical director, Dr. Patel, who reviewed it with a puzzled expression. "That's unusual," he admitted. "EEG patterns like this would suggest conscious awareness, but Richard's structural brain damage is too severe. There's no way he could be experiencing consciousness. This must be some artifact of the monitoring equipment, perhaps electrical interference." But Emma knew better. The patterns were too organized, too consistent to be random interference. Something was happening to Richard during that hour. Some return of the consciousness that had supposedly been destroyed by his stroke. Emma began sitting with Richard during the 3 to 4 a.m. window, watching for any signs of awareness. His eyes never opened, his body never moved, but Emma felt something in the room change during those periods. The air felt charged, somehow expectant, as if Richard was trying to communicate something he had no means to express. One night, Emma spoke to him directly during the active period. "Richard, if you can hear me, if you're aware somehow, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you're trapped like this. Sorry we can't help you, but I want you to know. Someone sees you, someone acknowledges that you're still in there." The EEG monitor showed a spike in activity, a burst of electrical signal that seemed almost like a response. Emma felt tears running down her face, overwhelmed by the tragedy of Richard's situation. If he was indeed conscious during those periods, experiencing awareness while trapped in an unresponsive body, the horror of his existence was unimaginable. Emma advocated for Richard's case to be reviewed, arguing that his unusual EEG pattern suggested he might be more aware than his diagnosis indicated. But the medical consensus was clear. His structural brain damage was too severe, and the EEG patterns were likely meaningless artifacts. There was no treatment to offer, no intervention that could improve his condition. Richard remained in his bed, caught in the liminal space between life and death, perhaps experiencing brief windows of consciousness that served no purpose except to remind him of everything he'd lost. Emma's time at Willowbrook changed her understanding of death and dying. She'd always thought of death as a clear boundary, a moment when life ended and everything else ceased. But the facility taught her that the boundary was far more ambiguous, that consciousness didn't always depart cleanly, that some part of people might linger in the places where they spent their final days. Margaret calling for help that never came soon enough. The walker making eternal rounds through Wing B, the cold sadness of room A23. Richard's fragmentary moments of awareness. All of them suggested that the end of life wasn't as definitive as medicine claimed, that something persisted beyond the clinical definitions of death. Emma developed protocols for dealing with these phenomena, unofficial procedures that she taught to the night shift staff. Acknowledge Margaret's calling, but don't search endlessly for her. Give the walker space to complete its rounds. Enter room A23 with respect for whatever grief remained there. Speak to Richard during his conscious periods, offering comfort to whatever fragment of awareness might be listening. The protocols weren't in any manual, wouldn't be approved by administration, but they made the night shift more bearable for staff members who had to work in a facility saturated with loss and endings. They provided a framework for coexisting with the strange phenomena that characterized Willowbrook after dark. Emma continued her work as night shift supervisor, continued her vigilant care of patients who would never improve, never leave, never experience any ending except the final one. She learned to navigate the space between life and death that long-term care facilities occupied, where biological existence continued long after meaningful consciousness had ceased. She learned that some questions had no answers, whether Margaret was truly a ghost or just an acoustic phenomenon, whether the walker was a spirit or a collective hallucination, whether Richard's conscious moments represented genuine awareness or merely random neural firing. The uncertainty was frustrating, but also, in a strange way, comforting. Not everything could be explained, not everything fit into neat categories. Willowbrook Extended Care continues operating, continues providing care for patients who need it, continues existing in that strange space where life persists without quality, where consciousness fades but bodies remain functional. And every night between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m., Emma Rodriguez supervises the night shift, responding to medical needs while navigating the unexplained phenomena that characterize the facility after dark. She knows that Margaret will call for help, that the walker will make its rounds, that Richard will have his brief moments of terrible awareness. She's learned to coexist with these phenomena, to provide care in a place where the boundaries between categories, alive and dead, conscious and unconscious, real and imagined, have become permanently blurred. And she knows that one day, probably not too far in the future, she'll hear a new voice calling from one of the wings, or feel a new presence making rounds, or discover a new patient showing impossible signs of awareness. Because Willowbrook collects these phenomena, accumulates them over years and decades, each ending leaving its trace, each death adding to the facility's strange atmosphere. Emma has learned to accept this as part of the job, part of working in a place where people come to die slowly. where the process of ending extends over months and years rather than moments. Some part of them stays behind, she believes, unwilling or unable to fully depart, maintaining a presence in the hallways they wandered and the rooms where they spent their final days. It's not the career in healthcare Emma imagined when she first became a nurse, but it's the career she has, and she's learned to find meaning in it. She provides care not just to the living patients, but also, in her own way, to the echoes of those who've passed, offering acknowledgement and respect to presences that official medicine refuses to recognize. The night shift continues hour after hour, night after night, year after year. And Emma Rodriguez maintains her vigil, supervisor of the living and witness to the dead, working in a facility where the two categories have learned to coexist in uncomfortable proximity, neither fully separate nor completely merged, existing in the gray spaces that characterize so much of human experience when examined closely enough.